The Marines were the first to land at Guantanamo.
Navy ships and planes placed communist-dominated Cuba under
Off another explosion. America was spoiling for a fight.
The United States sends troops to Cuba. They do expel the Spanish, and they also abort the independence movement. Instead of Cuba gaining its independence from Spain, they become basically a vassal state of the United States of America.
Eventually, the U.S. formally grants Cuban independence, but on two conditions outlined in the Platt Amendment. First, Cuba must allow the construction of a U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. And second, the U.S. can intervene militarily in Cuba at any time.
Under the Platt Amendment, the United States has the right to intervene in Cuba, and it does intervene in Cuba whenever a U.S. Sugar company feels threatened by a rebellion.
So for the next 2 decades, the United States repeatedly sends troops to Cuba to protect American interests.
And Marines under Colonel Batista have begun their attack on the National Hotel.
But by the 30s, a new reformist government in Cuba threatens to undo American dominance. In response, U.S. officials persuade a young general named Fulgencio Batista to overthrow the new government. That's what he does in 1934.
Fulgencio Batista becomes our man in Havana under Batista's thuggish rule. The United States turns Cuba into essentially a playground for the rich and famous and an economic pool for the U.S. mafia.
The Monte Carlo of the Americas.
Prostitution, narcotics, gambling, all of that going on.
From his stronghold in the wild Sierra Maestre Mountains, Cuba's Fidel Castro emerged triumphant after 2 years of guerrilla warfare against the Batista regime.
After decades of brutal dictatorship, Fidel Castro's guerrilla forces reach Havana. The Cuban Revolution begins.
And from there, of course, U.S.-Cuban relations start to deteriorate almost immediately. And by December of 1959, the CIA is already suggesting that Fidel Castro be assassinated, along with Raul and Che Guevara.
Just 2 years later, President Eisenhower breaks diplomatic ties with Cuba after Castro expels diplomats from the U.S. Embassy. And later that year, the CIA attempts to overthrow the Castro regime with the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion. It's defeated in just 72 hours by Castro.
The Bay of Pigs becomes a disaster for the Cuban exiles and for the United States.
Fidel is convinced that the United States of America will not stop at anything to roll back the Cuban Revolution, and he accepts the Soviet offer to put intermediate-range nuclear missiles on Cuban soil. That leads to the moment in which the world faces nuclear Armageddon.
Navy ships and planes place communist-dominated Cuba under close surveillance as Russian ballistic missiles are detected on the island.
This sudden, clandestine decision is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
After a 6-day standoff, Kennedy and Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev come to a secret agreement. The Soviets will withdraw their missiles from Cuba in exchange for the U.S. removing its own missiles from Turkey.
The world stepped back from the abyss. Those who lived through it never forgot the fear.
The Cuban Missile Crisis is over, but Kennedy imposes a full trade embargo on Cuba. it will come to be the symbol of U.S.-Cuba relations for the next 50 years.
This is an ABC News special report. Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
And we're coming on the air now because President Obama about to announce a dramatic change in U.S. relations with Cuba.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba.
That announcement comes after 18 months of secret back-channel diplomacy, known inside the White House as Project Ardilla. And they work out an arrangement not only for a historic prisoner swap, but also a package of complete normal relations.
Will you visit Cuba in your final 2 years as president?
You know, I don't have any current plans to visit Cuba.
Not ruling it out?
Well, let's see how things evolve.
And that is where we are today. One of the most intractable issues in U.S. foreign policy history may be improving. Lighter restrictions on trade and travel, and a newfound relationship 150 years in the making.
When what you're doing doesn't work for 50 years, it's time to try something new.